Good morning. I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Minneapolis Audit Committee for Tuesday, January 26th. My name is Lene Palmisano, and I'm the chair of this committee. With me on the dais are the following committee members: Councilmember John Quincy, Park and Recreation, Commissioner Tab, Committee Member Tab is running late, but will be here, Vice Chair Mark Oyas, and Member Scott Neal. Please let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Colleagues, we have a very full agenda today. We will be hearing several updates from our auditor, including completed audits, the 2015 annual report, and information about the 2016 audit plan. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda before you as presented?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt the agenda. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the agenda is adopted. Before we move on to today's presentation, we need to accept the minutes from our last meeting, which was on October 20th, 2015. I'll move adoption of those minutes. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and those minutes are adopted. Colleagues, the next item on our agenda is an addendum to the Records Management Audit Report that was presented to us and published on October 20th. Here to present is our Director of Audit, Mr. Tetzel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Audit Committee. The audit team decided to perform some additional testing based on one of the findings in the records management audit that we presented at the October meeting. And so I wanted to quickly go over the results of that. The objective of this test was to understand the access controls around PeopleSoft HR. And so the original finding had misquantified the number of employees, and so we looked at it a different way to get a better sense of what was really going on with that. And so the approach that we took was looking at all employees that had terminated their employment with the city from January 1st to late November of 2015. And then we compared their date of termination to when their access to PeopleSoft HR was cut off. The challenge here, and some of the results aren't as conclusive as we'd like them to be, is that the control that HR has in place, and we can see that it's happening, changes someone's access to self-service only. That's the goal. When an employee leaves the city, we allow them 30 days to go into PeopleSoft HR and look at their personal information. It might be about their retirement funds, it might be about their benefits, it might be about their paycheck. It's called self-service. And the idea is after 30 days, then we cut that off. When we try to go back and audit that, we can't see what types of access they had before that. We can just see their last level of access. So it's hard to tell what their access was after they terminated unless they were not terminated when we pulled the data. When we pulled the data, all of the terminated employees' accounts were locked after that 30-day period. What we did find, there was over 1,300 terminations this year. That a little over 1,000, the security profiles remained unlocked for that self-service over those 30 days. That doesn't in itself propose a significant risk because all you can see is your own data. But the fact is some of these went well over 30 days, and when we finally turned it off, they did have some elevated level of PeopleSoft HR access, they could still get into some city systems. Another thing is that we're currently not using logging when we're making some of these changes, and that's why we can't tell what level of access that someone had prior to the final access that they have recorded in the system. And so I wanted to actually draw this out because it might help to explain what's going on. Does this microphone work over here? Okay. So as you can see here, we have a little chronological display. The first chevron being the last date of employment. And here, what the goal is to limit their HR profile to that self-service. And then the next chevron is this HR profile lock. So we can tell that HR has a process to go in and look for profiles that have hit that 30-day mark, that self-service mark, 30 days after termination, and then completely lock that profile down. So if we call this day 0, ideally on day 0, we'd like to limit that profile to self-service. And then between or throughout the year, HR conducts this control. So it happens at various intervals. What we're seeing with the data that we looked at this year is that teams within the city aren't great at always getting this information, termination information, into the system or to HR. So what's happening is we'd like to see at day 30 that account locked, but this might be day 30, let's just say day 30 plus for example's sake. Someone might have gone in and realized, oh, we had this employee that has left the city. Now we're going to enter their termination date. So then it goes back to here and the HR control will catch that. But what the gap here is that we're not consistently getting that termination date or that information. Either the department can do it themselves, some departments do it themselves, or some departments have HR do it in a timely fashion. And that's why we're seeing the results that we're seeing. So if it's 30 plus, the backdate that we finally get that information and backdate it, then again, when that HR control functions, it'll catch that. But it's catching it after the fact because when they're running this, they're not even aware that this person is terminated.
Mr. Tetzel, we have a question. Member Newell.
Mr. Tetzel, I was trying to understand this in reading it too, and I couldn't. So this is helpful to me. Is there a way to fix that? Is there a way through creating some kind of protocol about fixing that second date, about how many days out that could occur? Or is that not reasonable in this case?
The only way to fix it is for departments to understand that it's important for them to get this information to HR timely or to their person who might administer that information in HR done in a timely fashion. This year, this year was a little bit unique. We had the PeopleSoft implementation, so there was a lot of work being done in and around PeopleSoft within HR and other departments. But it's still, I think the onus really lies on supervisors and using the termination process. And HR does have a termination process and checklists and tools out there to use it as they should be. Otherwise, it's up to HR to both either run that control or have a general understanding of when someone might have quit, but that's we can't rely on that. So it's an enterprise issue.
Member Tab.
Is this tied at all to payroll in any way?
It shouldn't be, no.
Okay, because I was just wondering if there was a way to sort of check a box if somebody was, this will be this person's last paycheck or something, so that, you have to generally, I guess, fill something out for payroll, and if there was a way to tie something there.
Council or Chair Palmisano, Commissioner Tab, there's a potential for that because we can see a weakness in that control there. There's a potential for an opportunity for that to happen. We'd have to do some specific testing and audit work to determine around payroll to determine whether or not people were paid beyond their last date of employment.
Thanks. Go ahead. Keep going.
We had several recommendations for HR, really starting from not allowing access to the system at all after those 30 days, ranging to if we're going to remain allowing this access, let's put some more controls in place. And HR they've already worked on several of these recommendations. The only one that they didn't agree with was one of the recommendations was to to have the portal. So with HR, PeopleSoft HR and PeopleSoft Finance, there's a web portal that you can access that. And so they don't have to go through the city's network to get onto those. One of the recommendations was for that portal to be self-service access only. Like you couldn't have elevated access. If you were an HR supervisor or manager or director, you couldn't use the portal to do your work at home. You would have to use your laptop and VPN in and go through the network. They didn't agree with that recommendation, but all the rest that they did agree with. Any other questions on the updated testing?
Nope. I'm going to ask when we go through the audit work plan to prioritize a little bit more analysis into this. But are there any other questions from the committee on this one? With that item, may I have a motion to receive this audit addendum report and direct staff to publish this addendum? Great. Seconded?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you. This report will be received and staff will publish this addendum to the report. The next report on our agenda is the report on last year's audit of the city's human resource personnel file, maintenance and retention. Mr. Tetzel?
Thank you. This, I'm going to go back. This audit came about when we were working on the records management audit, which is one of the large audits we did last year. Because of the scope of it, we didn't get into a detailed analysis within any department about their records. And with working with HR, the department did have an appetite for us to help them get an understanding of personnel files, which were decentralized a number of years ago in the city, to see whether or not those personnel files were maintained adequately, if the right documents were in there, if they were secured. And there's most employees, the vast majority of them also have a medical file, if those were separate from the HR files and were also secured, because that has some very sensitive information in there. We felt that that was important as well. It was something that we couldn't cover in the records management audit because of some scope limitations and resource limitations. So we thought that this would be a good audit, a somewhat quick audit to get done in 2015. And I'll note this audit did include the Park and Rec Board at Commissioner Tabb's request. So the Park Board does have some independent HR functions, and so we did a separate testing of the Park Board and the city. And so the findings are separate as well. So we had 3 findings for the city. The first one being existence and completeness of personnel and medical files. We noted that 81 out of the 107 files, there was some document that was missing. So the HR has a very long laundry list of things that could end up in someone's personnel file or medical file. We asked them to identify some of the key pieces or the critical pieces of information for our testing, because we didn't want to test for all of them. These might have ranged from a signed application, an offer letter. There's a lot of components in there. Not all of these things were critical to the personnel file being unusable. If there's just pieces of information in there that weren't available, and some of them, rightfully so. We've moved to NeoGov, the new recruiting and hiring system. For some new employees, we noticed that some of that information wasn't there. It was still electronic, and so we have some commentary on that that I'll talk about at the end of these findings. The second finding is around accessibility and separation of personnel files. So for all the departments that we tested, we looked into where their files were kept, that they were in locked cabinets, and that the medical files were separate from the personnel files. One thing that we noted when departments will archive their personnel files a number of years after an employee leaves the city. So those will go to HR and they'll hold them for a while, and then they'll send them off for longer term storage if necessary. We wanted to make sure that those archived files were secure as well. They are within the HR department in a storage room, and the storage room is used for some other things as well. There's other things that are stored there. So we got the key logs from NBC to get a sense of how many people potentially have access to that room where these files were on cabinets, but on unlocked cabinets, so accessible to anyone that could get in the room. There was 225 keys made for that specific room, and the ownership of those was varied. Some of them were master keys, some of them were in key boxes, but there were probably much more than anyone anticipated being. So HR has already worked on remediating this and making sure that, one, they get locked cabinets for that room, but two, they work through this issue, and I think they're working on electronic badge controls for that door there. The third finding, which was similar between the city and the park board, was around the I-9 process. So HR had done some work into the accuracy of I-9s, but wanted us to look into how well we thought the I-9 representatives throughout the city understood the process and the risks and the ramifications of not performing I-9s appropriately. So we created a questionnaire, and for the city of Minneapolis, we facilitated those questions with a certain number of I-9 reps, and then at the park board, they did that for us and gave those results back to us. They were somewhat similar in that the reps probably need some updated understanding of why we do I-9s, how quickly we need to do them, what some of the ramifications of not doing them at all or not doing them in a timely fashion are. And we noticed a direct correlation between people that do them more often and an understanding of why and how we do them and the importance. There were many more I-9 reps in Park and Rec, probably because they have a lot more locations that they work in. I think anyone who was potentially a hiring supervisor could have been an I-9 rep, where in the city there's far fewer. I think there was about 50, if I'm correct. And so this can be fixed pretty easily with some training, communication, and maybe some realignment of who facilitates the I-9 process. It is an important process. A couple commentaries that came out of this work. The first one was around electronic files. And we noticed and will continue to notice that we're going to have more electronic documentation of things that are going to end up in the personnel files and the medical files. And so we mentioned to HR that they should start to consider how to handle this. At this time, it's sort of unknown, but anyone who should have access to someone's personnel's file should also have equal access to any electronic documents that we don't manually print out and put in those files. So there'll come a time when the majority of them will probably be electronic, and so they need to keep in mind that we should think about how the evolvement of technology is going to impact these files and how they should continue to work with electronic files, and making sure that both people have access to the ones they need, but they're also being retained in the same fashion and for the same time period as the manual documents that are in these files. The other one, due to the noticing how many keys were made for that door in the HR department, we'd recommend that the city do a physical access review for doors that still have keys, not electronic badges, to maybe get a quick sense of how many are out there, and is there a need to rekey some of the doors in the city? Are the controls adequate about getting keys back from terminated employees, either back to MMB or to the department, so they can do with it what they need to? But it seems like there's an opportunity there to mitigate some physical access opportunities that we see. Any questions on the HR personnel file audit?
I think Councilmember Kano, you have your flag up. Do you have a question? No. Any other questions from the committee? I've had the opportunity to speak, through agenda setting and that sort of thing with our director of HR, and I know that the purview of this committee is not to direct work of our enterprise departments. I do appreciate the conversations that we've had in this. I welcome if someone from HR, if Mr. Champa, who I see here in the audience, wants to comment on some of the work already being done to mitigate these things, I welcome that if you wanted to just come up. And then I also know we have Teresa Chaika in the audience. If you'd like to, comment on some of these. I know that a lot of this was useful work. I know that we're already doing a lot of good things here to remediate it long before we were able to bring it here with the final report. But just through the scope of this is a really healthy thing. Mr. Champa, did you want to say just a few words?
Yes, thank you. I'm Bill Champa from Human Resources. I'm a manager, and I'm here representing Chief HR Officer Patience Ferguson. And so, first of all, I want to thank the committee, and I want to thank Will Tetzel. This is a audit that we actually asked for, as he mentioned, and so this is very important information to us. Patience Ferguson has been with the city for 2 years, and this has been a big priority since she's been here. And we've been working on some of these, and this reaffirmed a lot of what we already thought we knew. But this was very reaffirming to us and quite helpful. So a couple of quick things of what we've been doing. The access to the room. First of all, I will tell you that that's a storage room that not many people in HR even know exists. That said, there's the key access and there's that problem. We've already remedied that. We're in the process of changing that. So the only 2 people have access to that room, 2 trained people. In addition, we're working longer term on the card access so we know exactly who goes in and out of that room. And can audit that on an annual basis. So we're working on that. We're also working on locked file cabinets in that room. And I think the biggest piece that this report reaffirmed and that I think many of your questions address is really the responsibility out in our departments. We have a couple of different key personnel. This process is largely decentralized, the maintenance of personnel and medical files. So educating those folks, training those folks, and then holding them accountable is extremely important. And we're working on all 3 of those. We have we've designated an HR staff person to lead this work. And to work with the departments to kind of tighten this up and clean this up. So I'd take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? No. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Chaika, did you want to come up and just say a few words about this engagement and your perspective on it?
Commissioner Tabb, committee members, I appreciate you allowing me to come up. I appreciated that Commissioner Tabb invited us to be a part of this. It doesn't hurt to be checked on. We are separate from the city. We work with them in HR on some things. Our file room and the I-9 process is separate. We have the luxury of having much smaller amounts of data, and it's in one spot. I can say that the security, what wasn't mentioned, is all the doors, in fact, 2 of them. We have we have smart cards. So that can be turned off instantly, which is nice that we can control who has access. We do our filing system is different, and we started about 8 years ago. The League of Minnesota Cities recommends we have separate files, and it's more efficient for us. And I know the city probably can't do that, but when a supervisor wants to come in because our people move around, they bid and they move around, and they want to see the performance. All we have to do is, as a small HR department, pull out that performance file. We don't have to go through the whole personnel file to pull it out. We find it really efficient. As far as the I-9s, to go back to our personnel files, we've had NeoGov much longer than the city did, which is the electronic hiring process. So ours applications were electronic much sooner than the city was. So I think that kind of got reflected in the audit. We didn't have them, they're electronic, whereas the city wasn't. For the I-9, we are looking to go back to E-Verify. We had E-Verify many years ago, and it was in conflict with the city. They had to stop because of the judges or something was coming on. And we had to stop it. But we're going back to it. We found we can do it separate from the city, and the city's doing it. We will retrain our supervisors. That was one of the recommendations. 2016 budget has a trainer coming on board, and that is one of our objectives, is to get our supervisors trained on everything up to date. So I appreciate you listening, and we look forward to being able to talk about the improvements we've made to our policies and the I-9 process.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest and for seeking out internal audit to do this specific audit. You know, this is a healthy process. We learn things, and the great thing is that as soon as we do, our departments take immediate action to fortify and correct our processes. So I'm glad about that. Super. Thank you. May I have a motion to receive the Human Resources Personnel File Maintenance and Retention Audit Report and direct staff to publish this report? So moved. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the report will be received, and the staff will publish it. Next on our agenda is the Internal Audit Department's annual report for 2015, summarizing our 2015 audit plan and those results. Also client satisfaction surveys and staffing and budgeting request updates. Mr. Tetzel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The ordinance for the city requires that internal audit publish an annual report, but not what was in it. So we gave it a shot. I'd appreciate any feedback for information that you guys would like to see in there or would expect to see in there. I'll give you some highlights. You received the report. We had 6 projects that we completed this year, 2 audits and 4 consultations. Out of those, we had 15 findings, or out of the 2 audits, we had 15 findings. So a consultation won't have findings per se. Those findings consisted of 33 recommendations. So a finding really talks about a risk that needs to be addressed, and there might be multiple recommendations within that finding. The 4 consultations resulted in 46 recommendations. So in total, we had 79 recommendations in 2015 in the work that we did, 98% of which were agreed upon by management. And I mentioned the one that wasn't before. The reason that we talk about management agreement is because it's a measure of the reasonableness of the work that we're doing and what's achievable for the enterprise. There's a lot of recommendations that you could make to completely fortify a process or a department or a system, but there's a cost to doing that. And so we really strive to work with departments, and some departments can do it very well on their own, to come up with appropriate remediation actions and responses to the work that we do. And so far, that's gone well. Follow-up is another key aspect of the work that internal audit does. With the findings that we have, without following up on them, the city would never know whether or not anything is changing. And so follow-up activity will continue to consume our time, and it'll probably gradually increase, hopefully to a plateau, and then we can keep it there. When I joined a little over a year ago, the prior audit team had, I think, about 24 audit findings that were still outstanding. So we decided that we should work on closing those out. We've closed out 21 of those in 2015, some of which were folded into some findings and recommendations that we had in some of our current bodies of work. Some of them were folded into some of the state auditor findings that the finance department is working on. So rather than sort of double dip on some of that work, we found that there was some parallels between issues that the auditor had seen in the past and some of the things that are currently being worked on here in the future. So we made a note to aggregate those and close them out together. As I mentioned, the audits done in 2015 produced 14 findings. When we issue an audit report, management will respond to that report. Sometimes those responses will include a remediation plan and dates and such. Sometimes they don't, because they need to go back and figure out exactly how to do that. So we'll be working here in short order with these 14 findings in the departments that they're related to understand what their remediation plans are, get some goals in there for dates, and then build out our spreadsheet so we can start tracking those. You'll hear much more about that in the next meeting in March. Lastly, I wanted to talk about client satisfaction surveys. I pinged a couple peer city auditors to find out how they were surveying their clients and got a few examples of surveys, and then took the questions on there that I thought were applicable to us. We tried to keep them pretty general, so we didn't elicit emotional responses. Most people don't enjoy being audited, and so we didn't want to let people take that out on us, but rather how well are we doing what we should be doing from a communication perspective, from a timing perspective. There are a few categories there. So audit planning, quality reporting, timing, communication, and recommendations. The survey results came in at an average of 82%, which I think is a decent balance. Too high, and I would question whether or not we're being too easy on people or not digging deep enough into some of the real issues. Too low, and we're probably not doing our job well enough, or communicating well enough, or creating hostile environments, so on and so forth. So I think 82 is a good spot to be there in that satisfaction survey.
Mr. Tetzel, we have a question or comment from Mr. Oyes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I looked at the materials ahead of time. Really, I did. And I was wondering what bothered me about the 82%. And I'm just curious about the individual, the four components of that. Where are we stronger? Where are we, usually what my experience has been is when you get to the recommendations part that goes, sort of lower, it would drag the aggregate down. Or would you say 82 represents the client satisfaction across the four items that you looked at or asked for?
Yeah, so I'll tell you how we calculated these and then speak to that, Madam Chair and Councilmember Boyce. So as to not skew the results, we created a score for each project because some of the projects might have 10 respondents, some might have 1 or 2, and so we didn't want those 10 to over skew the score. So each project that we have gets its individual score, and it's based on those 5 components. In looking at those 5 components in aggregate, there's a little shift towards some higher scores in timing and communication, and a little bit lower in recommendations, but nothing that really got my attention. Maybe 5 points or lower, and I can send you some of that detail. I have that in a spreadsheet if you need it.
Mr. Tetzel, thank you very much. That's fine. I just wondered if we're still kind of dragging around on the recommendations, but it sounds like that's comparable to all the other 4 components. So thank you.
The annual report also includes some language around our mission and our vision. Nothing really comment on here, but that's that for the annual report.
Mr. Tetzel, I just want to say this is exactly what I'd hoped for when we imagined a fully functional audit team a couple years ago. We've cleaned up old findings. I hope people are all pleased with that. We've got a feedback loop, a productive feedback loop, and that's really important, and about our working relationship as an internal audit group with clients around the enterprise. Are there any thoughts or questions from others? May I have a motion to receive and file the 2015 internal audit annual report? Great. Second? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The report will be received and staff will publish it. I'm also pleased that our last item under new business today is the 2016 audit plan. Part of our role as a committee is to review and approve a yearly audit plan that guides the work of our audit department through the rest of the year. So, Mr. Tetzel, could you go forward with what we will do this year?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The process to come to our audit plan was similar to last year. We conduct risk assessment meetings with departments and divisional leaders. We solicit information from council and from the mayor's office, and we just gather information from the work that we do and the experiences we have and the meetings that we have throughout the year. So it's it's a continual process, and I want to note that again, the audit plan is a point in time. We always try to stay as appraised as we can on emerging risks, and if something comes up that is more important or more pressing than something that's on the plan, we like to exercise our right to reprioritize and change that. And my job is to communicate that to the audit committee. If there's something that comes up that I don't agree with, or that I would like the committee's opinion on, then I'll wait till the next meeting. Otherwise, we'll typically run it by the chair and make some of those changes as they occur. The 2015 plan changed dramatically, as was expected. We didn't get to all the departments before we put the plan out, so we met with Public Works and CPED over the summer, and those meetings drove some pretty significant changes in the plan. The 2016 audit plan consists of 14 projects. 4 of those are carryover projects from last year, and I'll talk about those as well. There's 8 audits, 5 consultations, and 1 program audit, and that program audit is a carryover from the prior year. So I'll go through the projects on the list, and then you can either interrupt or we can talk about questions at the end. These are in alphabetical order. They're not prioritized in order of risk or importance, but the 2016 ones are first, and then the carryover ones are the last 4, so they're not mixed in together. The first project is an audit of the accounts payable processes here, and the objective is to evaluate key processes and controls around payment timeliness, accuracy, and fraud. The next project is a civil rights contract compliance audit, and the objective of this audit is to review the processes and regulation in place for civil rights contracting requirements and review the execution consistency and accuracy of the respective processes. The third project is around IT projects management. This is a consultation, and the objective of this consultation is to determine if the city has adequate project management processes and tools to guide system implementations. I want to note here, right now we're experiencing a lot of system implementations at the city, rightfully so. The management of those projects doesn't solely lie on the IT department. Certain departments are all over the spectrum in how engaged they are in a project implementation, and so this isn't specifically focused on the IT PMO, although there'll be a core piece of this work. It'll include also the city department's participation in this. The next project on the list is a license plate reader pre-requirement review. This is a consultation. The police department uses the license plate reader software, and there's some legislation out there that it will require a biannual review of this. The first audit, or biannual audit, sorry. The first audit will be due in 2017, and so the police department wanted us to come in and look at that license plate reader program, and based on some of the language in that legislation, give the city an opinion of anything that they need to improve to prepare themselves for this audit. If the audit goes well and there aren't any recommendations, we'll probably look to post this as the first required audit of the system. So it'll be similar to what we would do in the next steps, but this is really a proactive approach to making sure that the controls and processes in place around this are adequate. The next project on the audit plan is on the Park and Rec Board. It's around worker safety, and this is an audit, and the objective of that is to determine if the Park and Rec Board has practices and procedures in place to both prevent injuries and adequately address injuries that do happen. The Park Board has done quite a bit of work around this as of late, and they've asked us to come in and help them get an understanding of how adequate those processes are, if anything needs to be altered based on that, and how well that's performing. Also identify any gaps in those practices as well. The next project on the plan is off-street parking operator, and this is an audit with an objective to evaluate the service level agreements and city and vendors' adherence to contractual requirements. as you all probably are aware of, in October of 2015, we continued to work under ABM to operate the off-street parking in the city. The contract is somewhat different than it has been in the past. This has been audited before by the prior audit team, but Public Works and the audit department agreed that it'd be good to look at this again under the new contractual terms and potentially a different scope than what was done in the past. The next project on the list is a PeopleSoft Finance Access Audit. Similar to the work that I presented first here in the meeting, we've done some pretty significant access testing on the HR PeopleSoft module. We want to do the same thing on the Finance PeopleSoft module. Part of that being that the city doesn't have an enterprise-wide approach to monitor system access. And so we're going to hit some of these big systems and then work with departments or divisions to see if we can improve our access monitoring within the city. The next project is PeopleSoft Web Portal Security. And this is an audit and the objective to determine the adequacy of security controls for the PeopleSoft web portal. So if you'll remember, we talked about the HR access to PeopleSoft. There's a web portal for PeopleSoft Finance and PeopleSoft HR where an employee can access that system remotely, not through the federated network. And so we want to look at some of the security controls that we have on that web portal to make sure that they're adequate enough to prevent any malicious activity. The next project is a police body camera pre-requirement review. So similar to the license plate reader, right now there's pending legislation of a tri-annual audit of body camera processes around the data that's collected there. So as we get a better understanding of the language and where that's landing, the police department again asked us to come in similarly to the body camera pilot program consultation that we did last year, help them understand any gaps or opportunities that they have in adhering to the triannual audit requirements going forward. The last of the
Mr.
20...
Tetzel?
Just real quickly, Mr. Tetzel, in the audit plan, it was a cut and paste, and so it repeats the license plate reader down there. Maybe not on the PowerPoint, but in this bad boy.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Tetzel, in this one, just take, it's just it needs to clarify and that it's body cam.
Gotcha.
So no big deal. Just, we don't want to publish it with that in there, that's all.
Yep, I'll fix that. Sorry about that. The last of the 2016 projects, Transportation Management Organization. This is an audit around third-party governance, which I'll talk about in my auditor update. In this audit, the objective will be looking into some grant compliance, but not limited to that. There's an organization called Move Minneapolis under the TMO that will be doing some audit work around. The last four projects I'll go through a little bit quicker because you've heard about them before. CPED loan lifecycle, we're in the fieldwork phase of that. It's a very large audit. I would anticipate that coming to the May Audit Committee meeting. ELMS, which is Enterprise Land Management System implementation. There's some sort of ad hoc consulting that we do on that. I think that is slated for an October 2016 implementation there. There's the NCR Neighborhood Programming and Support Program audit that we've outsourced. That should come to the March Audit Committee meeting. They're wrapping up some final pieces of that report. And lastly, Police Records Management System implementation. This was something that was on the plan for last year, but the bulk of the work will happen this year. They're in contract negotiations now, so we'll plug in a little bit later in the year to help the police department understand some of the configuration considerations they're making and just generally address some of the risks of such a large-scale system implementation that touches so many other systems within it. At that, I'd like to invite our IT auditors to come up and quickly just talk about the audit plan and the audit planning process.
Thank you. Before you do, Mr. Neal has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one quick question, Mr. Tetzel. Concerning the scope of the civil rights contract compliance audit, just a scoping question. It says review the execution, consistency, and accuracy of the respective processes. I take it the scope of your audit is just to look at how the contract is, the solicitation process and the award process. You're not following it all the way through to the end to see if what was contracted for was actually provided or not.
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal, correct. Yeah, it'll just focus on some of those requirements that the city has through the Civil Rights Department that they uphold there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You wanted to invite up Mr. Homestead to say a few words? Mr. Homestead?
Madam Chair, council members, my name is Tim Homestead. I work with Backbone Consultants. We provide the IT audit services for the city of Minneapolis. Just wanted to talk about how we completed the IT audit risk assessment in alignment and coordination with Will Tetzel and his team. We took the approach very similar to Will's operational audit staff, where we interviewed key leaders, key stakeholders, and key project managers to identify projects and scope for this year. We based the analysis on inherent risk, the project scope, the service impacts of the organization, as well as the previous audit date. And we used the framework that's based on the Government Accountability Office, Federal Information Systems Control framework. So based on that, we identified a list of primary projects to focus on throughout the year, as well as some additional secondary projects which didn't meet the criteria to fall into the primary projects based on either risk, resource availability, but as Will mentioned, based on emerging risk, additional items may be moved into the primary focus for the 2016 proposed audit strategy. Are there any questions related to the IT audit scope for this year?
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I did want to mention that although it's a challenge, we had a huge amount of potential projects for this year, so it really speaks volumes to how forthcoming department heads and divisional leaders were in our risk assessment process. There's still a really high demand for the services and the value that we can provide to the city. So the challenge being balancing what people ask for with what we independently think the city needs from an audit perspective. But that's a good problem to have from my standpoint.
Super. This is the end then of the presentation on the audit plan. Super. With acknowledgement, this is a guide and we're constantly assessing risks and there's a lot that you're looking at. May I have a motion to receive and file this 2016 annual audit plan? Super. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and that report will be received, and I'll direct staff to publish it. I also have, from your earlier presentation, Mr. Tetzel, I want to make a staff direction in regards to the 2016 audit plan. Thank you for this audit plan. This plan and the items on it vary a lot in size and in scope. I like that most of them were ones that we were requested to do, not all of them. Some are on the leading edge of policy, like data privacy standards and the like. I think that's going to be really informative and help us to really stay on top of those things. Some is on all the flux of multiple IT system implementations going on, which we all feel the pain of around the enterprise and from our customer service standpoint, from the public that we serve. I really appreciate that in light of the human resources personnel file maintenance and audit report and some of the things that came up in that, I'd like to make a motion to direct staff that within the scope of the 2016 work plan, could you analyze the enterprise practices for employees that terminate employment with the city? Could you report back on this plan update, how that might fit into this 2016 plan at our next scheduled audit committee meeting. I'm curious what policy issues could be put in place given best practices research. I'm curious what are recommendations on methods that could help us drive a better accountability to be really diligent when an employee leaves the city, for us to be very specific. It seems like in part that accountability isn't really with HR, but it's with the individual departments, and that's hard to make consistent. But I know there's some things out there that we could do to make a pretty to help drive accountability, to make an impact fairly quickly here. So I'd like to make that motion to try and incorporate an analysis of that within this year's audit plan. Could I have a second? Super. A motion on this. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Mr. Tetzel, you also have an update for us on previous motions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as we typically handle, I want to use this time to update you on our progress to date. Right now we have 4 projects in motion. And I've spoken to these. These are the 4 that rolled over from 2015. We don't just stop working on something if the year rolls over and the audit plan rolls over. So we'll continue to see those projects to closure. The only one that's significant is the CPED loan audit. The rest of them are really winding down. You have asked in the past for an update on the state auditor findings, and what we do and what we've done here is we don't. I want to be clear on what's getting presented here. Audit does not go in and validate the remediation of the state auditor findings. Rather, we just corroborate with the finance department, specifically the controller, on their progress to date, and then keep you guys appraised of what that is. Happily, there's really just 2 things that are outstanding. One is around loan C documentation. That's going to require a system implementation, and so that's why you see an August of 2017 date. The MIN system, which they're currently using, is getting replaced, and it's something that we're helping them look at and helping IT gather some minimum requirements on in the work that we're doing. And the other one being the prompt payment of invoices. And they're continually working on that, I will say, but by June, I think we hope to see that finding drop off of the audit or the state auditor's report. In meeting with AP in our risk assessment process, we got a better understanding of why we're seeing these late payments on the state auditor's report, or their opinion of it. And it's not that the invoice doesn't get to AP timely, it's that it doesn't get back. AP sends it out for approval and coding, that sometimes it doesn't get back to them in enough time for them to pay it. So they won't pay it until it's approved by the appropriate person in the city. And sometimes those approvals can take a while because either the invoice isn't clear and it gets potentially misrouted, or there's a lot of information that the person on there needs to check off to make sure that we are paying it. So we're going to look into that a little bit more in the AP work that we're doing in 2016. And then we're also looking into some of the language in that requirement. I think it's a 35-day requirement. According to AP, it should be 35 days based on a clean invoice. Sometimes we don't always get a clean invoice. So making sure that when we get findings like this from the state, that those 2 dates they're comparing are from that clean invoice date, not just the invoice date that comes from a vendor. I mean, you could put any invoice that you wanted onto it. You could put it already a year past, and once we get it, it's already overdue. So hopefully that'll help out a little bit. So it feels like they're making great progress on these state auditor findings, which we're happy to see.
Yeah.
I mentioned before, but I'll bring it up again. There's 3 of the 24 findings from the prior audit team left open. We're currently working on those and getting traction on those. And the 2 audits from 2015 produce those 14 findings. Again, working with those departments and leaders on their remediation plans and dates, and we'll have, once we get that solidified, that'll be much more transparent to myself and the audit committee, and then we will stay appraised of the progress on those and report to you at each meeting. One of the things that I mentioned last year was this idea of third-party governance, and so I wanted to get back to it because we're solidifying this more and more in the audit department. I'll first explain what I mean by third-party governance. A third party could be a vendor, it could be a partner, a strategic partner, it could be a grant subrecipient, any entity that we contract with or work through to provide services or do something on behalf of the city. A theme just in the audit world in general has been emerging in the prior years around how organizations govern third parties and what levels of controls and processes they need to make sure that the higher risk areas that you have when you ask someone to do something on your behalf or procure things from other entities. And so we've done a few things here. One, we put together this illustration to help understand how we're going to approach this work. And if you remember in some of our earlier discussions, we talked about this 3 lines of defense, that internal audit model, 3 lines of defense. We take that same approach with third-party governance and trying to illustrate how or visualize what this looks like. So the first line of defense for the city is really the contract execution or the grant execution and that vendor risk management. This happens with the city employees who deal directly with these third parties. It usually lives in the departments. The second line of defense are functions of the enterprise that help facilitate that process. So contract management, finance management, grant management, IT security management, the city attorneys. So there's a lot of functions that happen within the city to help that first line of defense when they both arrange for a contract to be executed, but in the facilitation of the continual facilitation of that. Again, we see ourselves as that third line of defense, but differently from the models that you've seen before. Not only do we plan on doing work around the first line of defense and the second line of defense, but we're going to get audit coverage with those third parties. And you've seen that in the 2016 audit plan, the TMO audit that we're doing. So we do want to make sure that we look at the landscape of our third parties and with the limited resources that we have, adequately address some of those high risk areas. This will include auditing some third parties, but some of that work will be looking at what we do here in the city and how we manage that effectively.
Thank you. I just want to jump in here and say, yeah, this speaks to one of the audits, a fairly small audit on our 2016 work plan. It is important, and we have seen in the past when we've worked with partners that didn't have the kinds of checks and balances that we expect from a city relationship. While we only have a very limited bandwidth to do these, and we have a lot of small partners, organizations that we work with, as we should, it is important to put them on notice that they may be audited by our city's internal audit team. So thank you. This is an important aspect, and this is part of our total risk picture.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few things that we're doing in this regard to third-party governance. We're building out some templates for departments to use so they can sort of plot their third parties and help get a visual understanding of where those high-risk ones are, where they should be focusing some of their activities. We're also developing some sort of core audit procedures. So if we're doing an audit of an area and it happens to be something where there's a third party involved, we can pull some of these standard procedures out and execute them where they make sense against some of this work and sort of get that coverage, push this theme through some of the work that we're already doing. So we're putting together some of those sort of standard audit procedures that we can plug and play into some of the audit work that we're going to pull off this year. And then accounts payable, the accounts payable audit on the audit plan is also, if you think about it, a second line of defense here in the third-party governance work. So we're going to look at them and get an understanding of some of how they're managing some of that third-party risk that they own from an accounts payable perspective. This is it's a big effort, and it'll roll out sort of slowly, but we want to start a little bit stronger this year in getting departments involved. We can't force anyone to, but if we give them tools that they'll hopefully use, we can help them understand how to use those better. And that in turn helps us understand where some of the bigger risk lies with some of these third parties.
Great. Questions or comments on this part? No. May I have a motion to receive and file the update from the internal auditor?
Can I do that?
Please.
Thank you. So moved.
Thank you. Seconded?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and this report will be received and filed. The next item on our agenda is the performance review of our internal auditor, Will Tetzel. The committee will adjourn to room 321. That's the Weber Pond room. And for those on the dais, that's off to your right for that performance review. And we'll be looking to have a closed session on that. Thank you.